Hey guys, so I know I'm a little late to this party, but I mean, I literally just started this YouTube channel. But anyway, to start, I really wanted to talk about my favorite movies of 2022 because 2022 was really an amazing year for movies. Like, it was honestly one of the best years for movies I have ever seen. There were honestly hardly any movies I didn't like, even movies that other people hated, I actually really enjoyed. There were just like so many creative and innovative movies this year. So, this is my top 10 favorite movies of 2022. Note that this is not my top 10 best movies of 2022. Basically, I think that like best refers to like the 10 movies I thought were the most well made of 2022. So, take a movie like The Banshees of Inisherin, for example. Like, yeah, the movie is obviously like a masterpiece. It has one of the best screenplays of the year. It has some of the best performances of the year. It's one of Martin McDonagh's best movies. The thing is, I don't actually have that much else to say about it other than that. So basically, these are the movies that I thought were the most unique or interesting of the year. These were the movies that I thought were the most creative or did stuff that I had never seen before. Movies that I think if enough people paid attention to them, that they can have a really positive impact on filmmaking. Some of them are in my top 10 best of the year, some aren't, but I do think at least all of them are good. Okay, so in case you're wondering, these were what I thought were the top 10 best movies of the year. Again, some of them are in this list, though about half of them aren't. And just so no one is like, well, why didn't you include this movie? Here's a list of all the movies I actually did see this year, because no, I can't see absolutely everything that comes out in a year. And finally, don't think too hard about the order of this list. While my number one pick is what I think was the best movie of the year and maybe one of my favorite movies of all time now, the rest of the order was just the order that I thought would be the best to talk about the movies in. So, like, I didn't necessarily like my number 2 pick more than my number 10 pick, for example. But with that out of the way, let's get started with my number 10 pick. So, for context, I watch a lot of indie movies, I watch a lot of art house movies, and I try to watch as many foreign movies as I can. And I do genuinely really like these movies, like movies that most people would just call Oscar bait. I actually really appreciate and I absolutely love, and I think they're genuinely well made. And so just keep that in mind when I say that not only one of my favorite movies of the year, but what I thought was legitimately one of the 10 best movies of last year was Puss in Boots: The Last Wish. I'm as surprised as you are. Okay, so like for context, I had like literally zero expectations going into this movie. Like, it's a sequel to a pretty mediocre animated movie that came out over 10 years ago. That's part of the Shrek franchise of all things, from a studio that basically only had one really, really good movie and the rest is like hit and miss. So I basically went in expecting like a couple of fun jokes, cool animation, and that was kind of it. But holy crap, this movie was amazing. So basically, there's a lot of reasons why I love this movie. One of them has to definitely be the animation. And this is what has me most excited about Puss in Boots and DreamWorks in general. So DreamWorks has been a studio that for the most part plays it pretty safe. And so to see them experimenting with animation like this is really exciting. Honestly, I've always felt like that animation was one of the most like underappreciated parts of film. As much as I love Disney and Pixar movies, I do kind of hate them for basically normalizing this really generic style of animation that started with Toy Story and we're still reeling through. And because they're so popular, virtually every animation studio, DreamWorks included, loves to include this style in pretty much all of their movies. And so it's disappointing because animation like requires creative art simply to exist. Like, if you can draw it, that can be an animation style. And to me, it's just so disappointing that so many studios aren't willing to take advantage of that. And I always thought that it's better for studios to try to pick animation styles that are interesting, but also fit the story that the movie is trying to tell. Sometimes, yes, Disney and Pixar do choose stories that fit their slightly cartoonish, but also slightly realistic animation style. Like, it's pretty hard to imagine movies like, you know, Inside Out or Zootopia in any other animation style than the one already in. But I can't help but imagine what it would be like if movies like Moana or Coco or Encanto had art styles that were more inspired by the cultures that inspired their stories. There are studios that are willing to more experiment with animation, like, of course, Spider-Verse had a very comic book inspired art style, and they actually changed art styles depending on what universe the characters were from, which of course was super cool. And then you get studios like Cartoon Saloon, which is like my favorite animation studio of all time, who have a very distinct animation style that's like nothing you've ever seen before. But as cool as it is, like, it is the same style over and over again. Like, I take one look at Wolfwalkers and I immediately knew it was from Cartoon Saloon. So then basically DreamWorks, one of the probably studios that plays it the most safe, drops 2 animated movies this year with drastically different styles. Like, first you get The Bad Guys, which I personally really loved, mostly for its animation, which has this like comic book cel-shaded style that's like not nearly as realistic as most animated movies, along with this like white and yellow bright color palette that really gives the movie this whole like fun Ocean's level style of like not taking itself seriously at all, and just makes the movie like so much more fun and interesting. And then you get Puss in Boots, which instead goes in a wildly different direction of like this very painterly style that looks like it kind of came right out of a storybook. And the purpose of that is that it's supposed to make the movie feel more like a fairy tale, which the Shrek franchise has always felt inspired by fairy tales, but Puss in Boots: The Last Wish feels like the first movie in the franchise that actually feels like a fairy tale just by looking at it. And what's really exciting is that these styles are not only drastically different from other animation studios, but they're also drastically different from each other. And what makes this exciting is that what DreamWorks is basically trying to do now with their movies, at least I hope so, is that basically taking a look at their movies and they're basically like, okay, what animation style best fits this story that we're trying to tell? They're basically actually using animation to help tell the story, which is like, they've been waiting 20 years for animation to finally figure this out, and they're finally doing it. And of course, the animation in Puss in Boots is visually amazing. Like, honestly, the last fight scene with Death Wolf and Puss in Boots is one of the most impressively animated scenes I have ever seen in my whole life. And normally this alone would probably be enough to put Puss in Boots on this list, but Puss in Boots: The Last Wish also has this like incredibly well-written screenplay that's like makes it one of the best movies that DreamWorks has ever produced. There's a lot going on that I couldn't praise. Like, the movie is genuinely hilarious, even on a second viewing, which, yes, I went to go see it a second time because it is that amazing.
You're all a bunch of knuckle-dragging, honey-scrounging, drug oafish munching, mangy nugget, and you're snooter!
And like what they do with the villains is just really cool and creative. I especially love what they did with Goldilocks and the Three Bears. That's something that I've never really seen done in an animated movie, at least not on that like level. And I thought that was just so cool. I won't spoil it if you haven't seen the movie. But probably the best part of Puss in Boots was the way it handles its themes. Because Puss in Boots has these themes of mortality and death, and it's not like Puss in Boots is the first kids movie to ever do this. But when other kids movies cover these themes, like Up, for example, usually they're covering the loss of other people, and so they're basically trying to teach kids how to grieve, which I think is really good and really important. But Puss in Boots is less concerned with like other people's mortality than it is with like the idea of facing your own mortality. Obviously, the whole plot of the movie revolves around this. Puss in Boots is basically like down to his quote unquote last life of his 9 lives, and the whole plot of the movie hinges on him basically trying to get his lives back because he's so afraid of death. This is, by the way, what makes Death Wolf basically my second favorite movie villain of the year, outside of probably Jobu Tupaki. He's just a genuinely menacing villain that reinforces the movie's themes. One of my favorite scenes in the whole movie is probably the scene in the beginning where Puss in Boots first meets Death Wolf. Basically, at this point in the movie, he's just been told he's down to his last life, and he encounters Death Wolf, has this huge fight scene with him, and then, I don't know, this happens.
I just love the smell of fear. What's the matter? Lives flashing before your eyes?
And it's like, I've seen prestige movies made for adults about death that were less nuanced than this. And it's like, this is the same studio that made The Boss Baby. Like, what movie am I watching right now? If I had to pick best completely animated movie of 2022, it would definitely be Puss in Boots. Yeah, you heard me, Guillermo. While I thought Puss in Boots was the best completely animated movie of 2022, I didn't think it was the best animated movie of 2022. That honor goes to Marcel the Shell with Shoes On, which is not only the best kids movie of the year, but might just be one of the best kids movies like maybe ever. If this were like a ranked best of the year list, Marcel would actually rank pretty close to the top. I'd probably rank it like number 3, if I'm being honest, because it's just a surprisingly really good movie, and it's a movie that nobody actually saw. It's easily the most overlooked movie of the year. The movie basically follows this guy who moves into an Airbnb and finds Marcel, this 1-inch talking shell, and basically makes a documentary about him.
Alright, so I'm making like a little documentary.
Oh, it's like a movie, but nobody has any lines and nobody even knows what it is while they're making it. No?
You may know Marcel from the short YouTube videos that went viral like 10 years ago or something. And while those videos are fine, the film actually finds a surprising amount of depth and emotional weight in this story. And they actually find a really clever way of incorporating the YouTube videos into the story. But what makes Marcel just so fascinating is just how different it is on like every single level. Like, obviously there's the creative level of making this mockumentary about a character like this. Marcel is this adorable character, but this is ultimately his like coming of age story, as the film is basically about him learning his place in the world and learning about how growing up is scary but also necessary.
Marcello, let's forget about being afraid. Just take the adventure.
This movie is very emotional. I mean, it's hilarious. Don't get me wrong.
Is this an inhaler?
It's like a slide or something. Like, I don't even actually know.
Where did you get that from?
From one of the people that stayed here for a night. What?
Did you take anything from me?
Mm.
What is wrong with you?
And Marcel is this adorable personality, and Jenny Slate does an amazing job voicing the character. I'm actually upset that there's not a good, like, an Oscar category for voice acting, because she would win immediately.
Finally, this is the sparkler. What you do is you light this end on fire and then you step back. This can act as a flare, alright?
But Marcel is ultimately kind of like a children's drama. I saw the movie 3 times in theaters and I cried every single time. If you've seen the movie, you probably know which scene I'm talking about. It's an incredible scene, by the way. You watch Marcel and then you go back and you realize just how uninspired so many kids movies are, and it's just like, it just feels like such a new radical direction to take kids movies in that most filmmakers wouldn't really even think of. And what I love is that it just works so well, that to the point where it's like, I can confidently recommend it to people. Like, it's not like Puss in Boots where I feel like, despite how amazing it is, I have to like explain to people why it's good, because they're probably going to look at me weird if I legitimately try to tell them that it's one of the best movies of the year. But with Marcel, I feel like I don't really have to do that. I feel like it's just the way it's presented is a way that not only will adults enjoy, but they'll also greatly appreciate and even get a lot out of it. So for next movie on this list, in fact, the next couple of movies are all horror-esque movies. And so horror movies don't actually usually scare me very much. I might be scared, or at least tense watching the movie, or at least creeped out, but I'm never scared after the movie, and there's never been a horror movie that's actually kept me from sleeping at night. Then I saw Nope. And Jordan Peele, like, are you okay? So yeah, Nope freaked me out a lot, and in order to talk about why I liked Nope as much as I did, I have to completely spoil the movie. And this is not only what I think is a really good movie, but I think a movie that's best viewed unspoiled as possible. So please just go watch Nope, then come back and watch this part of the video. Okay, so we've all seen Nope? Good. So yeah, Nope actually freaked me out so much that first night I saw it, I actually could not sleep because of it. Like, I guess what I'll call the digestion scene, like, really freaked me out, and every time I closed my eyes, I saw a blood-stained monkey staring right back at me. What I think is really cool, though, about Nope is that while I don't think it's Jordan Peele's best written movie, I do think it's his best directed movie. You really see from Get Out how his directing has slowly gotten better and more nuanced and more subtle, and even its themes. Like, Get Out, we all knew what it was about thematically. It's a great movie, but we all knew what it was about. Nope, I've seen so much debate on what it's really about, but we can all tell it's about something. I also just love how Jordan Peele is like popularizing thematic analysis of movies, which is long overdue, by the way. But with Nope, what's really interesting, I think, is the way that Jordan Peele like structures the movie. Basically, for the first half of the movie, aside from a pretty creepy opening shot and like one fake out, there aren't really any scary scenes in the first half. And what this does, kind of lets our guard down a little bit. Like, when I was watching the movie, I actually legitimately thought to myself, oh, well, I guess Jordan Peele's not doing horror then. And then he goes and drops like 3 of the most messed up horror scenes I've ever seen in my entire life, one after another. Basically what this does is that it kind of puts us in the same perspective of the lead characters, who in the beginning, they're just having fun trying to capture footage of a UFO, and oh crap, it's eating people, now we gotta kill it. And so in the same vein, we, the audience, have the same experience of not thinking we're watching a horror movie until, no, we're definitely watching a horror movie. The horror scenes are also just really well done. Like, the Gordy scene is one of my favorite scenes of the year, just by the way it's shot. Like, there's no music, it's all sound, and we see the entire scene from Jupe's perspective under the table. And so, because of that, we don't actually really see Gordy attack anyone, we just hear it, and it's really disturbing because we don't see it. And then Gordy sees Jupe and he comes closer, and I was genuinely scared during this scene. And here's the thing. We already know the outcome of this scene when we're watching it. Jupe is alive. He's fine. We've seen him recount the story earlier in the movie. And yet there's still tension here. And I think it's a lot of the way that Peele was able to shoot the scene and really just shows how far he's come as a filmmaker. I also just really love the final design of the alien jean jacket, and I think the idea of the alien was super cool. Like, most people see UFOs as like a spaceship housing aliens, and Jordan Peele's like, well, what if the UFO was the alien? And that's basically what Nope is. I love how Get Out and Us and Nope are all like really cool creative movies, but are like nothing like each other. And just like Peele seems like one of the few filmmakers who is interested in like constantly trying to show people something new that they haven't seen before. And every time he announces a new movie, I always get super excited for it, and I really can't wait to see what he has next, even if it keeps me from sleeping at night. Okay, so for my next pick, this really weird thing happened in 2022 that I've never seen before. Basically, a small standalone film that was not part of any sort of franchise or pre-existing property was made, and it did moderately well, and everyone just kind of forgot about it. And then only a few months later, a prequel to that movie was also released within the same year. And this isn't like a Marvel type thing, like where, you know, Doctor Strange and Thor and Black Panther all released within months of each other. This was a completely new property and not part of any popular genre like comedy or action. The first movie was X, a pretty good slasher movie, though not necessarily like anything that I think is memorable enough to really stick in your head. But then Pearl, the prequel, is surprisingly great. So Pearl, first of all, let's just get it out of the way. Mia Goth should have probably won an Oscar for this movie. Not just got nominated, but won. Yes, Cate Blanchett is amazing in Tar. Michelle Yeoh is amazing in Everything Ever All at Once. But my gosh, Mia Goth is just like, in this and in X and recently in Infinity Pool, she's just amazing in everything that she's in, and she's definitely going to win an Oscar sooner or later.
No, I'm a star! Please, I'm a star!
I'm sorry.
But here, she really drives the whole movie, and Pearl is just such an interesting story. It's basically the first horror movie made about the coronavirus pandemic, as like Ty West, the writer-director, basically finds these clever ways of drawing parallels between the flu pandemic of like 1911, 1912, whatever it was, and the COVID pandemic. And it's basically becomes a horror movie about like nothing changing, even though you want it to change so badly.
Now, caring for your family during these times is admirable, but you only get one take at this life.
If only they would just die.
Pardon?
Nothing.
And the whole movie is basically one of these movies where like the lead character just like slowly goes insane. And what's cool is that unlike movies like say Taxi Driver or Joker, you actually empathize, or at least sympathize with the character of Pearl, and you understand where she's coming from to the point where you kind of want her to win in a way. You obviously don't agree with how she's doing it, but even near the end of the movie, when she's killed multiple people, you're still kind of rooting for her because you just feel for her that much. And Mia Goth just gives such an amazing performance of the character.
I want to be loved from as many people as possible. But truth is, I'm not really a good person.
I also just love the filming style of Pearl. Like, most horror movies focus on like dark imagery and color palettes, whereas Pearl is light and colorful, and it's filmed as if it were the early 1900s. A lot of people have compared it to movies like The Wizard of Oz or Mary Poppins, and Pearl is basically those combined with Carrie. But what's cool is that this might seem like it detracts from the horror, but actually elevates it because, first of all, it fits the character, who is very lighthearted and very innocent, mostly. But then it adds to the horror in the fact that like it contrasts greatly with the disturbing images that we're seeing, and it just makes the whole movie uncanny and kind of creepy to watch. Even by the end, this movie has one of the creepiest end credit scenes. Not even scenes, just end credits in general, to be honest. And what's I think even cooler is the fact that Pearl actually makes X a better movie. So Pearl was advertised as the prequel to X, which I understand. So here's the thing. X on its own is fine. It's a pretty typical slasher. And I understand why they advertised Pearl as the prequel to X. X has a much more traditional slasher narrative, whereas Pearl is a lot more unconventional and experimental. I also think it's really hard to advertise X as a sequel to a movie like Pearl, considering it takes place like, I don't know, like 60, 80 years after the first one. But on its own, X is okay, I guess. Again, it's a pretty typical slasher, and it's well made and well acted, but overall at the end you're just kind of like, it's not a slasher. But with the context of Pearl in mind, suddenly moments in X take on new significant meaning. So the next movie on this list is probably the last like traditional horror movie, and it's a movie that I initially skipped out on in theaters. In fact, it's the only movie on this list I didn't get to see in theaters, which is Barbarian. Now, the trailers for Barbarian look weird, and that's because it's a horror movie, but most of the horror scenes take place in one dark location. So for like 90% of the trailer, I had absolutely no idea what was going on. So predictably, I just skipped out on it thinking it was just another traditional horror movie. But then everyone was talking about it online, and enough people recommended it to me that I had to check it out, and it's one of the most surprising horror movies in recent years. Now, there's a lot that I really like about Barbarian. I love the horror take on the sexual harassment idea, and I think they do an excellent job of narratively stripping it down. And that's the type of thing that I always really like in horror and in movies in general, but especially horror. But what I really like about Barbarian is just how smart of a movie it is. See, a lot of people tend to complain in horror movies when characters make dumb decisions. And, like, I get it.
Why can't we just get in the running car?
Are you crazy? But like after seeing Barbarian, I think the real reason people complain is because the movie didn't do a good enough job of setting up the characters. Because I think Barbarian knows that so long as you set up the characters and who they are and what their motivations are, then their decisions will make more sense. For example, they spend the first half hour building up the relationship between these two characters so that later down the line, when one hears the other screaming for help down this dark, creepy hallway, and she goes after to rescue him, you believe that that's what she would do in that situation because the movie did a good enough job of explaining and setting up her character. Even when characters in the movie don't necessarily make smart decisions, there's enough build up to that so that you understand that even though it's not the smartest decision, it makes sense that that specific character would do that thing in that situation.
Listen, AJ, I gotta tell you, there's no new money coming in.
Now, it makes sense for this guy, for example, to say he has a gun when he definitely does not, but it wouldn't make sense for this character to do the same thing because that's just not in line with who she is. And doing that just ends up making the horror of the movie more believable. And Barbarian is also really freaky, and it also has one of the best end credit songs I have ever heard in any movie ever. Absolutely genius. So next movie on this list is what I would probably say is like the weakest movie, which isn't necessarily to say it's bad, because I actually did quite enjoy it. But The Menu is something that's, I think, really unique and really different. So there's a lot going on in The Menu, and first of all, Ralph Fiennes gives an amazing performance and is definitely one of my favorite villains of the year. And the movie is pretty obviously a satire on class. You know, it doesn't do anything to hide that, but it's still good at doing that thing, even if it is like very plainly obvious. But one of the things I love about The Menu is, first of all, just it's a fun horror movie, if you can call it horror or thriller. It's the type of movie where like you never know where it's gonna go, but you're always intrigued about it going there. There's a lot of like small stuff I like. I love the, you know, Food Network type presentation of all the meals. I especially love it when they do Tyler's. I thought that was hilarious. I love, Ralph Fiennes' chef character just like messing with everyone for like 2 hours in a very creepy but very satisfying way.
You'll be given a 45-second head start, at which point members of my staff will try and catch you. If they do catch... Okay. 45 seconds starts now.
And it's overall just a really fun and really original movie, but that's not why it's on this list, because there are plenty of movies like that this year. Why it's on this list is because of how the movie basically originated. The Menu is basically a studio movie. It's not an indie movie. It's not an art house movie that's written and directed by some relatively unknown writers and directors, and isn't part of any pre-existing property or franchise, and isn't part of any sort of like commercially viable genre, and is completely original and unique and creative and fun and overall memorable experience. We don't really get that kind of movie very often anymore. And so it's really cool to see a studio just willing to, bank on this unique creative idea. You still get big studios making new original movies, but they usually tend to come from directors like Christopher Nolan or Jordan Peele, where it's like, even though the movie is unique and original, it's still technically part of some sort of like franchise or property, even that franchise is the director. So to see the studio actually willing to just make a completely original movie from, writers and directors who aren't terribly well known, at least not outside film and television, and have the movie still turn out as good and as fun as it is, I think that's really cool. And I honestly hope that more studios do that. And that's the real reason why The Menu is on this list, though it is still a good movie. However, I felt mixed about the ending, if I'm being honest, but overall it's a good movie and it's worth checking out. So The Menu is kind of a perfect segue into the next movie, because it's this combination of horror and comedy and satire, the 1%. And the next movie is more of a comedy satire of 1%. It's Glass Onion. Now, Glass Onion is obviously the sequel to Knives Out, and there are multiple reasons why I really loved this movie. However, I will say, like Nope, in order to explain why I like Glass Onion so much, I am going to have to spoil the movie. It's on Netflix, so you can go watch it right now, so just skip ahead if you haven't seen it yet. Well, one of the things I really like about Rian Johnson in general is that he does a really good job of misdirecting the audience. He knows how audiences watch movies, especially the mystery genre. And so he knows how to play with filmmaking and structure in order to misdirect the audience in very clever ways. Like in Knives Out, for example, he basically shows you the murder to make you think that you know everything, so that you stop trying to find the killer, and so that when the killer does get revealed at the end of the movie, you're still surprised. And he does a very similar thing in Glass Onion, but what's cool is that how he does it is actually reflective of the themes of the movie. So the themes of Glass Onion are obviously just like, getting rid of all the crap and just staring at what's directly in front of us, basically.
It all adds up. The key to this entire case. And it was staring me right in the face. Look into the clear center of this glass onion.
And with the killer being Miles, that actually is reflective of the themes, because basically, aside from Daniel Craig and Janelle Monáe, which are the two protagonists of the movie, so they're obviously not going to be the killer, everyone in the core cast, aside from Edward Norton, is like a pretty minor actor. Not that they're not well known, but they kind of pale in comparison to Edward Norton. And so basically, especially when we know that the real murder we're trying to solve isn't Duke, but is Andy, we're obviously looking for who the killer is. Now, Miles seems like the most obvious choice. First of all, is the fact that he has the best means and the best motive to go kill Andy. And then there's obviously the fact that he's played by Edward Norton, who is the biggest star of all the possible suspects. Here's the thing, Rian Johnson knows that we're looking for who the killer is, and so he's aware that Miles seems like the most obvious choice. And so therefore, because he seems almost too obvious, we just sort of, at least my experience with the movie was just sort of saying, it can't be Miles, obviously, that's too obvious, it has to be someone else. And so we end up ruling Miles out in our minds, in the same way that we thought we knew the murder in Knives Out. We thought that we could safely rule Miles out here because it's too obvious. So then when Miles is obviously revealed to be the killer and also apparently an idiot,
Miles Braun is an idiot.
It still comes as somewhat surprising. And what's cool is that that's actually reflective of the themes of the movie, which is because we're literally basically trying to get rid of all the trap, which is all the other suspects, and stare at what's directly in front of us, Miles being the killer.
Oh, she was clever enough not to fear Miles. But she didn't see the real threat, the obvious threat, until it was too late.
And so I think it's just so cool that Rian Johnson was able to sort of like take the themes of the movie and structure the movie in a way to misdirect the audience in a way that's reflective of those themes. I also think Knives Out is really good as a sequel, not necessarily in like it's a continuation of the story, obviously it's not, but basically, while this isn't really so much a thing anymore, there was a long time in Hollywood where no one knew how to make sequels, so they basically just did a carbon copy of the original movie.
Peter! We slept in! We did it again!
Glass Onion is basically that when you boil it down, but what's really cool is that it doesn't necessarily feel too much like Knives Out. There's another whodunit movie that came out this year called See How They Run. Now, it's a pretty good movie, but the parallels to Knives Out seem very obvious.
And then he was deposited here. Staged, so to speak.
But with Glass Onion, basically Rian Johnson copies his same formula from Knives Out. Bunch of rich jerks, and there's a sudden murder at one of their parties, and he's there to solve the case, and then there's a flashback that reveals new information that we didn't know, that gives us a different context of seeing the rest of the story in. Also, that the heroine in the movie, in both movies, is someone from the underclass. So ultimately, it's basically kind of the same formula, but I think whereas other Hollywood movies, when trying to do sequels, they will just do a carbon copy of the first movie. Here, Rian Johnson more or less just takes the basic ideas of the first movie and basically just dresses it up differently, which is, I think, probably a better way to go about doing sequels when you're doing a sequel to a movie that doesn't seem like it should have a sequel, which is the case with Glass Onion. So next is also a really fun movie. It's a movie that feels like it should not work, but it does. Because RRR is kind of awesome. Now, I don't really watch a lot of Indian movies, so I'm totally unfamiliar with like Bollywood and how, those movies are run. But RRR is, I think, to me, was obviously a really good introduction to the Bollywood type of movie. Basically, RRR is about these two real-life freedom fighters in India who The movie basically imagines, like, what if they were like best friends? And what if they just took on the British colonials like head on? And that's basically what the movie is. And the movie doesn't take itself seriously at all, obviously. I mean, we have guys throwing motorcycles at people, and that's like one of the more normal stunts in the movie. But that's also part of the fun, is just seeing how over the top and ridiculous this movie can be, while still being honest in its core relationship between the two lead characters, which was just really, really well done. And also just like the over-the-top nature of the movie just like fits the subject, because it's like portraying these like basically these Indian legends as essentially being superhuman, which is sort of what they were. They, you know, in a way, because they were freedom fighters, they were kind of real life superheroes in a way. And so it portrays them in this larger than life way that is just also makes it just so much fun. I also think the way it portrays its action is really good, because the thing is, like, action as a genre is kind of ridiculous when you stop and think about it. Like, aside from like sci-fi or fantasy, it's probably the most unrealistic genre out there. Like, how often do you get into giant action scenes? How often do you see that in real life? Almost never. And so my favorite action movies are usually either like take it very, very seriously and it feels real, or going in the opposite direction and just not caring at all and just going over the top with its action scenes, because at the end of the day, it's supposed to be a fun summer blockbuster, so why not make your action scenes as fun as possible? And that's what RRR does with its action scenes. That's something I wish that more Hollywood action movies would do. And the last thing I have to say about RRR is the way it does speed ramping. Now, speed ramping, you've probably seen this done a million times before. If you're unfamiliar with it, it's basically when a movie slows down or speeds up within the same shot. Zack Snyder does this all the time. Now, these types of shots always annoy me. I think the only movies where I've seen it done is any movie where a character, you know, can run really, really fast, like The Flash or something, and you see it from his point of view, or Inception, because it was part of the plot. I kind of cringe every time I see this type of shot, because it's so unnecessary and it calls so much attention to itself, and it usually is just kind of awkward and it looks ridiculous. This is why I hate it when Zack Snyder does these types of shots, is because he is often trying to portray subjects that are like serious and mythological, but by doing this, it looks kind of ridiculous. You know, like, the only thing that, you know, this shot seems to be saying is, look how cool these guys are. Don't you think they're cool? Well, look how cool they are. But I think RRR understands that, no, these kinds of shots make them look ridiculous, especially in action scenes. And so the way RRR does these is more appropriate, because it knows its action is over the top. It knows it's being absolutely ridiculous. And the speed ramping actually helps highlight that and helps you not take the movie so seriously, because you're not really supposed to take it too seriously. And it's just overall just a fantastic movie. And also, by the way, it has one of my favorite scenes of the year, dance off, literally. Like, there's a giant fourth wall break dance off halfway through the movie, and it shouldn't work, but it totally does, and it absolutely rules. So you probably notice a pattern on this list that I'm trying to like avoid prestige art house dramas, because I know that while I really love those kinds of movies, a lot of people don't really care for them. But Tar, I really have to talk about, because it's just so different from like all of them. But what's interesting about Tar is just the way it tells its story and the way it plays with narrative structure. See, like, Tar basically ditches the 3-act structure entirely. See, like, most English teachers and most screenwriting teachers especially are obsessed with the 3-act structure, which is understandable, because the 3-act structure is Like, you know, it's used for a reason. It works, it's good, but it can often be formulaic and predictable. Steering away from the 3 act structure is often difficult to do without your movie feeling awkward. What's weird about Tar is that it just basically completely ditches the 3 act structure entirely, and yet it somehow still works. What I really love about Tar is that you don't really know where it's going for the first like 2/3 of the movie. And a lot of things in the first 2/3 that are technically plot setup don't feel like setup. They just feel like things that are happening. And so then in the last third of the movie, everything comes crashing down and everything comes connecting all at once. And it's supposed to feel overwhelming. It's supposed to feel like your life is falling apart because of all these things that you just couldn't see coming from a mile away that end up ruining your life, basically. Which is the most I can say about Tar without spoiling it. It's a really unique take on telling a story that really fit, and it was one of my favorite movies of the year. If it weren't for my number 1 pick, this would probably be what I would say is the best movie of the year. But there was one other movie that I absolutely loved that I could not stop talking about to everyone I know throughout the whole year. It's a unique action comedy that cleverly combines action scenes and humor and has so much heart and just a really unique, incredible story that is emotional but also just so much fun. And of course I am talking about Bullet Train. I'm sorry, I couldn't do that. Everything Everywhere All at Once. I'm talking about Everything Everywhere All at Once. I mean, what can I say about this movie that hasn't been said already? I think it's honestly the best movie I've seen since Parasite. And even a year later, it's still kind of blows my mind a little bit. I mean, it's obviously like it's incredibly creative and the directing is just on point and the acting is on point, and you know, I love the emotional core of this movie and how it's directly tied to the plot of this movie, how basically the action movie is just a giant metaphor for the family drama, and it just does such an incredible job with that. A couple of things I really, really liked about Everything Ever All at Once. First of all, is just the directing. This is one of the best directed movies I've ever seen, because it's basically just like every shot, every edit, every camera movement feels intentional, even minor ones, like the way this camera just whips on the elevator or this transition from one scene to another. It's just very unique and original, and not only does like every one of these decisions I feel like works, but every single one of these like edits or camera movements or everything felt like they were the best possible choice for that moment in the film, which is not something I can really say about a lot of movies. This is basically the closest to a perfect movie I have ever seen in my whole life. I also really like how the film finds these really clever ways of combining action and comedy. A lot of action comedies will separate the action and the humor, basically. They'll have characters occasionally drop a funny one-liner while doing an action scene. Yet here, it's the action scenes that are actually funny and framed in such a ridiculous way that you can't help but laugh how ridiculous they are, but they also perfectly make sense with the context of the story.
Does my baby want to go for a walk?
And there are very few action comedies that can pull this off. The only two that come to mind that come, I think, even close to this level is like RRR and Scott Pilgrim versus the World. Everything else just like pales in comparison. And you know, there's a lot going on in this movie. I can go on for hours talking about how the screenplay is basically a perfectly structured story, about how the editing is, this is one of the best edited movies ever. I think that's like undeniable. How there's just like so many fun, creative ideas in this movie. How I've seen this movie like 5 times and I'm still kind of blown away by it every single time. What I love most about Everything Ever All at Once is just how cinematic it is. So there are movies where it's like, they're well made, but at the end of the day, like, they could be translated to another medium pretty easily. Like, there's no reason why a movie like The Banshees of Inisherin or The Fabelmans couldn't have been like a novel, for example. And most movies actually do kind of fall into this category where you could easily translate it to another medium. A lot of the movies on this list, but especially Everything Everywhere All at Once, it feels like a movie that can only be a movie. Like, there's just no possible way to translate this story to any other medium. I think maybe it could be a graphic novel, but I think even then you would lose something about it. And those are my favorite kinds of movies that are so cinematic and find ways to tell their story in such a cinematic way that they are inherently cinematic. They have to be movies. There is just no possible way to translate it to anything else. And that's the kind of movie that I hope gets made more often in the future. Well, thanks you guys for watching. I'm curious, what were your favorite movies of the year? What did you think of this list? Did you agree with this list? Which of these movies have you actually seen? So just, like, comment, and subscribe, hit the bell icon, all that good stuff, and I'll see you next time.